Okay, we're recording and I'm with Don Elliot. So Don, talk to me a little bit about where you are in your author journey.
All right. So I've published two books. Third book, all indie. Third book is coming out October 24.
Okay.
I've written a total of four books, so a fourth will come out the following year. And I don't know, 9, 10 or so short stories and a couple novellas.
Okay, nice. That's awesome. I've noticed something about you in the community that you like to write in like live streams and groups.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
talk a little bit about that because I love it. I think it's great. What do you get out of that? Like what's the benefit of that for you?
It's totally just a mind hack
Okay.
because in these groups, I mean, we might go a couple hours without even doing any kind of text chat.
Yeah, I
So
love
a
it. You
lot of
just get on
times
a
there's
Zoom
not,
call with your camera off. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's weird. And just there's this mental hack of there's somebody else in the room with you. And if you have an idea or something, you want to drop it into chat, but we don't do any like actual verbal discourse.
Yeah.
And so there's something for me that's just like, I'm a collaborative person. I feel more creative when I'm near other people. And so uh, just that sense that there is somebody else here who's struggling through the same things, who's doing the same things. And if I want to bounce an idea off, I can bounce it off them is it gives me a focus, I
Nice.
guess.
I love it. Do
Yeah.
you ever play team sports as a kid?
I did soccer and water polo
Okay.
were two of them.
Nice.
Did some skiing too, but that was individual. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I find
yeah,
that I like settings like you're describing that turn writing into a team sport. It's very helpful.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I
yeah.
always see you always put the Zoom link up in our Dialogue Doctor Slack, and I always want to join you, but whenever you do, I'm like right in the middle of usually another Zoom call with somebody else. I'm
Yeah.
always like, oh, I want to jump on, but I can't. But yeah, I love it, man. I love that you A do that for the community and B operate that way. I think it's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's a
Yeah.
lot of fun. We get as many as 6, 7, 8 people in there at times.
Yeah, it's very cool. Um,
Uh,
okay, so talk to me about the story we're discussing tonight.
okay, so every fantasy author has this giant story in their head, and if you ask them to talk about it, you've got 5 podcasts worth of content. So, so I'm going to try to give the brief version.
I like the
So
I
the
like the buckle up warning. Like just
yeah,
settle in. We're going on a journey.
yeah,
Yeah.
you asked
Yeah.
for it. Uh, so this trilogy that wraps up this October when the third book comes out was me wanting to cut my teeth on writing and learn the craft of writing before I start this giant overarching series.
Nice.
Um, so it was real deliberate, and I also used it to explore the backstory of the character and build out the world more. Um, so then I finished that series. The third book's with the line editor right now. Or sorry, the dev editor right now. And I still didn't feel quite ready for it. I still felt like that level of scope that I want to go into, which I'll explain in a minute. I still didn't feel quite ready for it. So I wrote a fourth book that was a standalone novel
Nice.
to introduce another person who's going to be a main character, one of the main characters, but in a different part of the world. So now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, I've got, 500,000 words of actual world building, another 500,000 words of actual prose, probably even more on the world building. I don't know what it is, but where it's like, I'm like, okay, I need to just buck up and do this. Like how long am I going to keep kicking it down the road? So I'm starting to wrap my head, and in the premise in a nutshell is it's loosely inspired by World War II and
Okay.
this idea of sort of rapid globalization. So you have a lot of different countries and peoples that are isolated, and due to an upshift in technology, such as air transport, all of a sudden, all these cultures that didn't collide before are colliding now.
Okay.
So there's this big, kind of ominous tone that I want driving things forward. So I want a driving force where you feel like there's this escalation, kind of like when you watch anything about World War II.
Yeah.
Um, so the rub is, and this is what made me, when we had that session the other day that you were doing for the community, and we talked about collage plot.
Yeah.
So part of what got me interested in collage plot, mosaic, braided. So I started studying those a little bit more since that conversation, because I think what I'm looking at is ultimately it's a collage plot, or maybe like a really thick braid,
Okay.
but it's ultimately a collage plot, I think. And in what I was studying, I was seeing how there's certain collage plots that are essentially an anthology with a theme,
Yeah.
and or a single instance, like Crash is a movie we were watching.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other end, you've got like Godfather, like we were discussing before, where there's a definite driving force pushing things through in that plot.
Yeah. So give me a second, because it's funny you
There you
use those
go.
terms. Because I have never, so in case anybody's actually listening to us, I've never used those terms outside of the community. So I feel the need to pause for a second to explain. Um, so
Put a test in
sorry.
you.
No, I'm laughing because I'm like, how do I explain that quickly? So talking about multiple vehicle stories where you've got multiple driving characters who have different point of views, you can kind of have working as we're working as a community on like how we plot that, because like you can have just like 7 hero narratives going on at one time, but it ends up being a lot, and not all of your vehicle characters are going to need that kind of hero narrative, especially if you're doing, and by hero narrative I mean that uh this Save the Cat, I can't think of the actual name of it, hero's journey, or you can do like
Yeah.
the heroine's journey, but then you've got a lot. So when you have these extensive plot systems that are designed for kind of one primary vehicle character with a supporting cast, and you try to force multiple vehicles into them, it becomes weird and crazy. So braided narratives are a narrative that already, a plot system that already kind of exists in the world. That's not one we made up, but it's and that's the idea that you have these people, these vehicles on their own journeys that are all overlapping with each other. Usually the way braided narratives work is you have major world events that bring everybody together. So you have like the braid of scenes, and then you have a big event in which all of the people have to react to, and then you have the braid of scenes and then a big event that everybody has to react to. So that's like, and often braided narratives need a clock, like they need a like timer that's running out. So you get that, like, otherwise you're like, where are we going? So the braided, like Beartown by Friedrich Bachmann is a great braided narrative example. It's got, I think at one point I counted 7 vehicles, 8 vehicles. It's got like 4 lead vehicles that like have really complicated growth arcs, and you're driving toward the hockey game. At the from the first chapter, this ends in this hockey game. So you are like moving, all of the braids are moving toward this big game against the rival town. So that's like an example of a braided narrative. I would say, like, Harry Met Sally is what I would call a chain narrative, where you have 2 vehicles and they like have their own stories, and then they touch in the middle, have their own stories touch in the middle. Again, very timeline oriented. Like there's a time to that. And with chain narratives, it works really well with like romance relationships, because you're watching people come together, right? Like and every time the chain touches, where they're both in a scene together, the question is like, have they figured it out yet? Have they like so? But we were studying The Godfather, and other stories like Love Actually is a good example of this, with like Hugh Grant, which I know, as a fantasy author, please don't murder me for comparing what you're doing to Love Actually. But it's that idea that like you have this, and this is called a mosaic narrative as well. A mosaic narrative, though, is more anthology-esque in that it's got a world and the world building is the point. And so your scenes are kind of standalone short stories, and they all come together to build this world. That's great, but like when you're looking at like Love Actually or The Godfather, the world building actually isn't the point. The point is the character growth. And so that mosaic model doesn't necessarily fully work. So we were calling it a collage in that you have this ongoing story that's built by these kind of standalone short stories. And the standalone short
Right.
stories could stand alone and be their own thing, but by putting them all in this collage, you get a deeper, richer picture. So like with Love Actually, you've got like, I think there's 5 stories going, and at the end they all kind of interconnect. There's no plot. It's not a braided narrative because time doesn't matter. Like, so they're not going at the same time. They're like popping in and out. Or The Godfather is an example of like, I think we counted 5 or 6 just like standalone stories that are happening.
Yeah.
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 And so now they all connect because they're the same characters. Supporting vehicles kind of come in and out. The 4 or 5 main vehicles stay through the whole thing, but you could take each piece and it would be a fine story by itself. Right.
Mhm.
Like, and for the collage narratives, what I'm seeing is that what drives that foreboding that you're looking for in the like overall plot of that kind of narrative is the characters really struggling with who they are. And so at
Mhm.
the end of each short story, the characters feel very unfinished. They feel like until they all die. So they feel like Sonny feels very unfinished.
You've read my books.
Yeah, until like yeah, until well, I mean, fantasy out there. We got to kill everybody because the cast
Yep.
is so big. We got to keep bringing people back. So Sonny's story feels very unfinished until we get to the end of Sonny's story where he dies. Right, like Michael's story feels at each piece feels very unfinished. Like what is this guy becoming at the end of each section of the story? He shoots the guys in the restaurant, and then he disappears. We're like, what happens to him? And then he reappears in Italy, and he seems to be a very different person. And now in Italy, and we're like, oh, where is this going? He's getting married, and we're like, what is happening? He's got Kay back in the States. Like, what is going on with this dude? And then his wife dies, and then he just kind of like the plot just jumps like a year and a half, right? Because time doesn't matter in a collage plot; it's all about the character growth. So, all right, I think I've fully filled everybody
Mhm.
in. I think we're like, and I think everybody's on page now. So you're thinking some kind of like complex vehicle plot. How many main vehicles are you thinking about that you're like, we're really going to live in these people's shoes?
Whew. Um, that's really tough because I'm still in the kind of exploration phase in a way. I'll tell you what I've got so far
Yeah.
is probably 3 or 4 that are like truly like this is if you had to distill it down to the main characters is 3 or 4. But
Gotcha.
altogether, as far as POVs go, I'm doing third person limited throughout the series,
Okay.
fairly close limited. So it's probably going to be like pushing 20, I want to
Okay.
say,
So we're going
for actual POVs.
full Song of Fire and Ice. We're going full Game of Thrones. We've got
Yep.
all the POVs, a whole world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going full Sanderson. I just want half the length.
Nice. Yeah. Um, that's awesome. So how can I help? Because I could just like sit here. We could just sit here and like jab. But what's going to be most helpful for you in the stage you're in right now?
Well, let me throw out this idea and see if this, because this is a combination, really a publishing strategy mixed with the reader experience, mixed with trying to pull something like this off.
Okay.
So, so uh, Wheel of Time, very large commitment
Yeah.
to read that plot. and you have to commit to the whole thing. Basically, it's a linear plot that goes.
Yep.
I mean, it's jumps around, but you have to commit to the whole
Yeah,
series.
great example of a braided
Um,
narrative. There's a clock coming, the bad
okay,
guy is
yep,
coming back to life. They're all fighting to like in different ways to stop this from happening. And you've got
yeah,
this like and you've got all these stories overlapping each other, and then they connect at like major moments. Usually middle of the book and end of
yep.
the book. Everybody connects and then they all break up again. Yeah.
And so for me, it was like, how fantastic would it be to take that or to take Game of Thrones and say, I don't want to read all 72 books. I just want to read Rand's storyline, or I just want to read
Mm,
Matthew, or I just want to read Ned Stark's storyline. And you could get, okay, well, here's the chronology of trilogies. Read these trilogies in a row, and that's the shortest version of this
mm.
story
Yeah,
from
yeah.
this character's point of view, or you can read the entire thing, or you could. So it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure
Yeah.
of trilogies.
It's fun because you could actually like sell a box set where you weave them all together.
Hmm.
Where you like you have the individual books that are all pulled apart, and then you could sell a box set that's like the chronological order of this story.
Yeah,
That would be fun.
yeah, and then mixing.
Yeah.
So that's where, as soon as I get into that, I'm like, okay, so I'm trying to tell the equivalent of a World War II documentary series with core characters where there's a central driving plot with multiple trilogies that can stand on their own. And so I guess that's a really big question to come to you with saying, uh,
How would you do that?
yeah, how do I do
How
this?
do you
What are
pull
the
that off?
pitfalls? Like
Do your
show
vehicles
me
do
the
your
way.
different? So you've got like four major vehicles. Are they all players in different nation states? Is that kind of how you're thinking about the World War II language? They don't have to be nation states, but like players in different
Right.
areas of.
Yeah, they're coming from different areas, coming in and out of each other's storylines. Yeah.
Okay. You almost want a Love Actually style story there where
Yeah.
they don't actually touch each other. They do at the like
Mhm.
in the end of that movie, you find out like, oh, they're all weirdly connected. There's a weird scene where they're like, one of them ends up being like the cousin of another one. Like it's a weird thing. You're like, why does this matter? It doesn't matter at all. But so there's that weird like they all happen to be at the airport on the same day at the end. But that's just cheesy romance stuff. But so I think the more for me, I would say because it's a war timeline,
Mhm.
I would build out the war first, like in your planning. I'd be like, here's how the war functions. Like so for if you're talking World War II, you've kind of got like the rise of Nazism and the like, initial attempts to pacify, and then the like start of small invasions, and then like the declaration of Britain's resistance with France, and then for a long time you have kind of the French and British front, and then you get the entrance of other players into the war, and attack on Pearl Harbor pulls in the United States. So you kind of have this timeline of like, here's how the war is going to spread through the world. Once you have that timeline, it empowers you to start writing your vignettes to engage at different parts. So like if you've got 3 or 4 main vehicles, like a Band of Brothers type, one of them could be like a Band of Brothers type story where you have that captain whose name I forget kind of stretches all the way through the war, right? Like he starts at the beginning and you see him run all the way to the end. But then at the same time, you've got the kind of companion piece to that, which is the Pacific War. And I think it was Spielberg may have made the Pacific. I can't remember, but somebody famous made the Pacific Front. And you can
Right.
you can watch those two on top of each other because they're actually happening at the same time, but they're in two
Hmm.
totally different parts of the world. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does that feel?
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And that was kind of the way I was leaning. Um, was if I could create the big, because when you study World War II, you realize for the most part there's no individual that made one significant, impactful. Uh, it was these small moments
Yeah.
that built the whole thing. And so, yet at the same time, for a narrative and with heroes and stuff, you do want somebody that makes this huge difference in some kind of capacity.
And
So,
yeah, and you've got him in World War II. Like you've got Patton, right? Like he's driving
mhm,
tanks. He doesn't win the war by himself, but you can say like without him, they might have been in trouble. Right? Like, or you've got
yeah,
like, on the other end, you've got like Rommel down in North Africa, really screwing with stuff
yep,
for a long time, right? Like, and then, you've got some heroes of the like Far Eastern Front, the like, um the bomber raids and stuff. There's that movie,
yeah,
Hacksaw Ridge is I think an example of kind of an Easter of a Pacific Front movie where you've got a singular hero kind of
yeah.
driving through. But yeah, I get what you're saying though. You can like, yeah,
Well, and making it in a way that's realistic, because I love the epic nature of Lord of the Rings, but I also want this to be a lot more realistic to war times. That makes sense.
yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, well, and the thing about Lord of the Rings versus what you're talking about like a realistic war is Lord of the Rings is that thing of like, hey, this whole thing kind of rests on two characters' shoulders, right? Like Aragon has to become the king, and
Yeah,
Frodo needs to get rid of that damn ring. those are the two. Those are the stories that matter, right? Like, so we're just
yeah,
following those two stories, right? Like, we don't really get out of their POVs much. You get Merry and Pippin kind of running around, but that's kind of a side plot. Like, it's less
yeah.
important than,
And I think that's where Game of Thrones for me, and I'm talking about the books because I don't want to
yeah.
get into the TV series and the ending and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
talking
I've
about the
I've
books.
never seen the TV
Uh,
series, so we'll stick with the books.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, you're fine. The I love the scope of the thing, and I like how they're capturing that. What I struggle with it that I don't want in my series is that, like The Godfather, you feel that drive of Michael Corleone.
Yeah.
Um, and you feel the drive early on with Marlon Brando, with the Dawn.
Yeah.
Um, Game of Thrones a lot of times just feels like vignettes of things that happen to be, and gradually there's little things that happen that tie themselves in, but I don't feel a little bit with Daenerys, a little bit with Jon Snow. You feel that sort of driving factor, but I'm gonna add with that every single scene that you're in that moment, that character is driving that scene. So you feel the drive
Yeah, the scenes are
every
beautifully written.
scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of what Game of Thrones suffers from, just from listening interviews that I've heard George R. R. Martin give, is that he didn't expect it to succeed. One, he was surprised by its success. So he hadn't really plotted the whole thing out. He was kind of like, oh, this is fun. We'll kill Ned at the end. We'll see what happens. Right. Like, so he's kind of discovery writing an epic fantasy, which, like, I'm not criticizing. It turned out great, but there are throughout major plot threads that get dropped. Right. Like, poor Rickon Stark disappears into the east and we never hear from him again. Like
Yeah.
somewhere in the
It's
third
gone.
book, there's a line about a wild boy running around with a giant dog. It's like, oh, is he coming back? No, he's not coming back. He's just out there, right? The poor drowned islands, they just kind of drown. And then we don't care
Yeah.
about them anymore. Right. Like it's, yeah. So I think you'll benefit, not necessarily that when you start writing, you have to have every vignette written, but I think you do need to know, like, here's the fronts, here's like the timeline for different fronts turning left and right, like turning to different leads. I would probably have a timeline of major events. You don't need
Hmm.
to know how your people play into those events yet, right? Like, are you a plotter or more a discovery writer? Like, where do you fall on?
I'm I'm bounce back and forth. I'm probably 60% plotter, 40% discovery, and I
Yeah.
bounce back and forth through the whole process.
Yeah, then I'd give yourself a lot of space to like discover
Mhm.
as you write. Um, but I'd try to get that big arching timeline in because it's gonna like down before you start writing anything of like, okay, I know that like this is where it starts, this is how it starts. Then these are the kind of big moves of these different nations to move in, and maybe even like defining some like I don't know, are you going to write all the way at the king level, or are you going to stick at like the grunt level? Like where are you most attracted to writing?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
So I
All of
would
it.
I would mark out the characters that you know you want to write. And then
uh,
I would probably know their movements and interactions. Does that make sense? And then like
yeah,
then if you know the timeline of the war, not down to every single battle, but like the big moves, and you know the turning points for different nations and like different people groups, um that all the way to the end, don't tell the
yeah,
reader all the way to the end, but go all the way to the end. Then you can kind of say like, okay, now I want to write this vehicle story, and maybe that vehicle is a major player in this front on this part. Maybe the royalty of one of the like arms of the war, and so you're going to write a part of that arm up to this battle where it looks like everything's turning the tide to their side. And then maybe you stop that novella there, right? Like they have a victory in the war. It's enough to kind of like give a full hero's arc there, as long as
yeah,
you have a really strong growth arc. And so that's what I would what's going to make the individual components satisfying is the reader falling in love with the characters. So the characters, once you have like the big world picture built, then you need to start thinking like, okay, if I'm writing this vignette, who does this character start out as, and who do they become through
hmm,
these events happening? Because that's what's going to tie. Like Band of Brothers, what we love about Band of Brothers is not that it runs through World War II. That's a cool setting. But what we love about Band of Brothers is that the opening commander, the guy who becomes the commander, becomes such an amazing leader. You will literally just watch him do everything. And the show kind of falls off when he goes off into administrative duty, right? Like because it's less fun. We're not watching him like super encourage his men. We're not watching him like look at his peers and gamble with the guys and then pull his peer out of the tent and look at him and be like, hey, don't ever put yourself in a position to take from these men, right? Like it's these great leadership moments of that character that we're like, oh, it's a cool background and a cool setting, but I'm watching for this guy. I'm watching to watch
yeah,
this guy survive the war. And then when we get to like that series, you could almost take the oh, what's the name of the battle in the forest where they're all stuck in holes? I can't remember. He's not there for that. That's one of the first big scenes that he's missing. But you've fallen in love with all of the side vehicles so much that you just want them to, you just want to know who's going to survive. I could see if you're writing this novellas, you could almost write that as its own standalone. Just that battle is its own standalone novella. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
yeah,
I like the idea of writing. We're getting these as novellas because when you were dissecting Godfather, it was surprising to me how few scenes some of these characters had, like Luca,
yeah.
um, who it was two or three scenes
He's got
total
three.
that he
He's got
had.
he's got two scenes, and you think, but what it is he's
He
got,
feels like a yeah,
yeah. Oh, he feels like a major character, but he's got such a
yeah,
powerful, and that's what I'm saying is that like we attach to characters who have these powerful emotional growth moments. So you see him sit. He's got three scenes. You see him sitting outside, waiting to be seen by the Don in the opening,
mhm,
and he's so nervous and so scared that we immediately relate to him. We're like, he says he's
yeah,
sitting there mumbling what he's going to say over and over again. And then we see him actually talk to the Don. And you get this moment of like a sense of victory for him, where you're like empathizing with his like, hey, he did it. Good job, Luca. And
Yeah.
then he goes to kill he goes to be a spy against the warring mob family. And when they kill him, it's so shocking because
Yeah.
we've fallen in love with him. We think he's going to be a big deal. We think that this is, but it's interesting, right? Because there's so many characters, but he's one that's six in all of our mind. Everybody who's watched The Godfather remembers the name Luca Brasi, even though
Yeah.
he's maybe of a 3 hour movie, he's maybe in 15 minutes. But it's
That's
that like
wild.
he has a full growth arc, right? Like, so we remember his life. Or oh, what's the name? I see his name starts with a C, and I'm gonna say Costanza, but that's George Costanza.
Clemenza?
Clemenza, thank you.
Yeah.
Clemenza is another one, right? Like he's got as the POV, as like we're living through as the main vehicle, we're living through his shoes. 3 scenes. He's in the
Mhm.
background, like wandering around, but he's making pasta sauce right during the part that's like Sonny's war. He's making pasta sauce, and we like connect to him because Sonny comes over and starts yelling at him like, I got bigger things for you to do. We then watch the fight between Sonny and Hannigan through the camera is literally behind Clemenza's shoulder. So you're like watching it
Right.
through his POV. You immediately relate to him again because he's this big joyful guy making pasta sauce. We're like, yeah, I like this guy who's like just happy to be around in the middle of a war. Right. Like, and then we
Right.
get him,
Right.
then he's gotta kill Paulie. So you have a moment of like, what do we do with this joyful guy? We watch him change and turn into this guy who's a little tired, it's a little exhausted, going out, leave the gun, take the cannoli. And then you
Yeah.
get this weird montage of everybody hanging out and having dinner and Paulie going to bed. And it keeps flashing back to not Paulie, Clemenza. It keeps flashing back to Clemenza going to bed. And it's like a POV from his scene communicating like, man, he is tired. And then
Yeah.
his last thing is them coming to the Don saying, can we be out? Can we be done? And it's that like you get a full growth arc from him, right? Like he goes from like
Yeah.
the joyful happy guy to like the exhausted guy, and he totally sticks in our mind. We 100% remember who he is because we connect to that like character change. So for all of your vignettes, whether they're like, 100, if you're gonna follow a like, let's say you have a Patton character that you're
Mhm.
just gonna follow from like his like drive to Berlin in your like version of the story, you get like 120,000 word novel following this dude drive
Mhm.
his tanks to Berlin, obsessively driving everybody insane, yelling about how he's lived all these past lives as Genghis Khan, right? Like just wild, big, crazy character. Um, you're gonna have those. They need incredibly complex growth arcs, but you could also throw in. I could see you like throwing in novellas around somebody like a Clemenza, who's like, he doesn't have the whole story. He's got like a little piece in the middle of this thing, and we get to
Yeah.
know him. We really like him, and he got disappears. And what would be nice is if the series, like if your series catches, if you've got like, I'm thinking if you've got three really strong like main novels and then
Mhm.
you've got all these little novellas around it and you're building a readership, they're going to be really excited when like Clemenza shows up in Patton's story. Yay,
Yeah.
there he
Yeah.
is. I wondered what happened to that dude, right? Like it's that kind of like bringing him. So I think there's cool potential there. Um,
I like the idea of the focusing in as novellas because the fourth book is shorter than any individual of the first three of that trilogy. But I wrote a novella. I wanted it to be two timelines. So one is the
yeah,
present day, and one's 100 years prior. And I wanted the climax of the present day to be influenced real directly just at the right time with the climax of the 100 years prior. So the climax of that is a revelation just in time for it to make sense for the climax for the present day. And to do that, what it decided to do was write a novella of the 100 years prior. And so that was, 25,000 words or something.
Yeah.
Then I wrote the present day and tried to weave it in. And I think that worked. It was an interesting exercise, but that's where I'm thinking maybe approach of this is seeing these more as interwoven novellas.
Yeah, and I think I do think to pull people into the story itself, you are going to need some solid novels that ground it.
Hmm.
You can't just do all novellas. You're going to have some, you know, strong, big kind of things that hold everything together. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Um
Like full
because
on, I was thinking like full on trilogies, for example, initially.
yeah. Oh, you were thinking like full on. Yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that would work.
Maybe some standalones mixed in,
Yeah,
but
sorry. I wasn't understanding what you're saying. I get what you're saying. Yeah, you want full on trilogies, some standalones mixed in, some fun novellas. I think what's cool about what you're planning is that it opens you up to do like some fun stuff. Like I think the character's name is Falstaff that
uh-huh.
Shakespeare brings back in all of his king epics, right? Like in all the Henry epics, Falstaff keeps like showing up. Like he's
Right.
never a vehicle. He's always like around in the background. And so it gives you the ability to have some characters that like they aren't vehicles, but they just keep popping up. Um
Yeah.
they don't have to always be serious. Like, Macbeth has is it Macbeth that has Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? They're
Yeah.
just kind of
Yeah.
like in the background, and then they
Or
got their
no,
own
but
play.
Hamlet.
It's Hamlet,
Hamlet,
yeah, it's
yeah.
Hamlet. Has Rosencrantz and
Yeah.
Guildenstern just like wander around in the background, and they get their own play. It's really hysterical. Like, but it opens you up to have these kind of reoccurring characters that can pop up across books that don't have to be main vehicles. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I had to that note, I had a character that I did as on the very first book, did a spreadsheet diagnostic and had a column for who I killed. And and I killed this guy named Phone. I killed him 3 or 4 times in one book because
Nice.
he was the perfect character to kill. He was like the right gut punch. He's not going to affect the plot too much, but it's a really good gut punch. So now what I've done is in every actual novel, there's a reference to a Thone somewhere in there. He's like my Who Killed Kenny.
That's hysterical. There's a podcast that I listened to for a long time, called Totalis Rankium, and they would do they were going through all of the Roman emperors. Like each episode was a Roman emperor. And they would joke about running characters. Like they had a character named Jeff who was like, if there was ever an unnamed messenger, he was Jeff. And he was, and it was this like, I think by the end of the series they were like Jeff number 82. Yeah, or it's just, fun stuff you can do
He's
when
a
you just
red shirt.
yeah, or
Yeah.
in my first series, in the first book, there's this character that's really scary named Bose. And he's like the main bad guy of the first book, and we kill him in the end. And then we set it up so that the villains kind of resurrect all the time. Just the villains. And so he comes back in the second book and we kill him in like the third scene. And I thought it was really funny. So there's 5 books in that series. We kill him in every book. And by like the fifth book, like, I think he dies 3 times in the fifth book. He keeps just showing up and we just kill him right away. Like, so it's just this like fun, but you do get to start having fun with like these repeated characters that you can just start kind of playing around with that almost become inside gags to the reader. Um,
Yeah.
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 You just got to make sure if you're going to use those, because part of the problem we have with Bose is we start bringing him back too often. So if you pay attention, he doesn't actually have time to resurrect. Like he's just like back. So if you pay too close attention to the storyline, it kind of creates a hole in it. So I think the danger is like if you don't have that big plot established and aren't like tracking where people are and when they are, you'll get yourself in trouble. Like, oh yeah, here comes this guy again. Like I always had an issue with Song of Fire and Ice because there's characters that like disappear and then
Yeah.
reappear, and they'll reappear like on the other side of the world. And R
Yeah.
has no
Yeah.
problem, makes no attempt to explain how they got there.
Yeah.
How did
It
this
might
guy
be
get
this
over here?
epic, it's this epic harrowing journey for these folks.
Yeah,
And then, yeah,
yeah,
Arya's just like, well, how did she do that?
yeah. Why is she over there? Yeah. Or the one that I always laugh at is Robert Baratheon's illegitimate son, who in the first book you think is going to be a huge deal. They build him out to be a big deal, and then he just disappears. And then, like in book 3, he shows up in the wilderness with like running an orphanage. You're like, where did this guy come from? How did he get out? Where are these children from? Why is he running an orphanage? What is happening? Never explained. Like
Yeah.
there he is. Yeah.
That's where the power, if you're not an outliner, if you're a discovery writer, the power of reverse outlining,
That's
I
right.
think, comes in.
That's right. You can be like, wait, what happened to that guy? Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, why does he have so many characters? Because of squirrels.
Yeah,
He chases them.
because he's chasing random things. He's funny though, because he'll like just big parts of the map suddenly appear. Like you're wait, there's another continent, and then you're like, wait, there's a southern half to the first continent, and it's like, wait, there's more ports out to the west. How does this work? Like it's just this like things just keep showing up. I remember when I was originally reading it, I had an old copy of like the first book that I got from the library before the second and the third books were written, and the map was very small. And then I remember I got to the second book, I'm like, whoa, what happened? Because all of a sudden there's like the whole world in there. And I'm like, where did all of this stuff come from? But yeah, it's the joy of a discovery writer is the like, there are no rules. I do what I want.
Do
Yeah,
what I want.
I do what I want. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, man, I'm anything else you want? Like, how else can I help you tonight? Anything else you want to talk about? Is this helpful? Just like jabbing this through?
Yeah. Yeah, just being able to riff off of it. I like the idea of I, I I think it becomes so huge in my brain because every character to me is an entire 10 book arc. At which point, this is 40 books long, and that's not what I'm going for.
Yeah,
Whereas if I think of them as more small, more reduced, so like Luca, where you can write a shorter story and then interweave it with other stories and drag it out. And by doing that, as long as there's an actual arc of some kind that's noticeable happening, because you mentioned about characters versus plot on this, and that's where I think of like a regular World War II documentary doesn't move me emotionally as much as a movie about Dunkirk,
yeah,
you know? And
yeah.
so how do I get both? Sounds like
Yeah, and I
what we're
think the
talking about.
key is the character. What's the name of the real famous documentarian? Oh man, I can't remember
Oh,
his name. He does all the PBS
Ken
ones. Yeah,
Burns.
Ken Burns. Ken Burns' documentaries are character based, and he'll take you
Yeah.
through a major event, but he follows one character after another. He's like, let's look at this character. Now let's look at this character. Now let's look at this character. Sometimes he's grouping characters into a chorus where he's like, let's talk about the Viet Cong. And he's
Hmm.
like, there's a chorus of characters. That's harder to do in a novel because the reader needs something to hold on to. Um, if you're going to have a chorus vehicle, something I think needs to happen, although I can't necessarily prove this because we're still kind of talking through these concepts. But, I think like 3 members of that vehicle, you still have to get personal. Does that make sense? Like, you
Hmm.
can't just say the Viet Cong because you're going to end up summarizing a lot. You want to avoid summaries. You want real scenes because it's like the interaction between the characters, the dialogue is what we're going to graft into
Right.
as readers. So if you're summarizing events, you might get some kind of like world building nerds who really love it, but most of your readers are going to come in the like moment where Luca is in the bar getting strangled. We got to know Luca. We got to feel him getting strangled. We got to see the look of surprise on his face. If you're summarizing it for us, it doesn't mean anything to us. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
it's why Fredo doesn't really matter in the first movie, because
Right.
he's never a POV character. He's never a vehicle. He's always just around, but he goes off to Vegas and we just hear kind of summary statements about him. And then we show up in Vegas, but it's really Michael and Tom's story. It's not Fredo's story, right? Like, he's just there. So it's that, but I think that's the thing I would be careful of, is there's going to be a temptation to write, like, to cover time, to write big spaces of summary, and
Hmm.
you're going to want to watch out for that. Does that make sense? Like, being
Yeah.
in the trees, in the forest, as opposed to looking down on the forest, is more important to the reader. And with such a grand scope, the temptation is going to be to do a lot of like, hey, let's helicopter over the top of the forest and talk about the whole forest. Where what the reader wants, and what George R. R. Martin is brilliant at, is he keeps us in the trees, right? Like,
Yeah.
when Ned goes to south to the capital, we go on the horse with Ned. We're in the Capitol walking around. Ned is talking to Robert Baratheon. Ned is moving to, like, we meet Littlefinger, not through a summary, but through Ned meeting Littlefinger, right? Like, that's how we like move through the plot. And so I think the hard thing about grand epics like this is the temptation is to think the world building and the history of the war is going to carry you, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's the intimate moments between characters that we show up for. So, like, you have to
Yeah.
have the grand plan, you got to have the grand vision of the world, but you have to get us into the individual characters and their lives for us to actually care about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's golden. That helps a lot.
Something the Cartherian Gambit series does that I love, that you may want to think about doing early and putting in the books as a way to like pull readers into more, is they have a giant timeline going of all, because their books, they're like 3,000 books in a Catherian Given series. I don't remember how many. And there's hundreds, and they span like literally thousands of years. So you can go to their website, and there's a giant timeline, and it shows you all the like area. Here, I'll just pull it up. It shows you like all of the Catherian Gambit. Shows you all of the books in order. Do. Now watch, they've changed it and it doesn't exist anymore. Now I'm a jerk. Um, oh, they used to have a pretty one. Oh, there it is. Maybe. Oh, yeah, here we go. So, they have like, what the Catherian Gambit series is?
I know of it. That's
Okay.
it.
This is Michael Anderley's thing, and he brought all these other writers into it. So you've got the different ages of his, and then once you get into the ages, you can kind of see the order that all of the series come
Okay.
in, right? Like,
Yeah.
I would start something like this early, where
Hmm.
I wouldn't worry about lining up books like he does. What's nice about this is it shows you, like, hey, look, these guys disappear and there's a really long timeline before their next book shows up. Right? Like, it shows you, like, hey, this guy, like, we've got this series here walking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 books following this character, and then she's going to disappear for a long time, and then she shows back up here.
Hmm.
So what's nice is it gives you, like, here's where you find this book on this, these two books come together. um what I would almost want for you, though, is a book that's like, here's a map of the world, and here's a timeline of the war
Hmm.
on a website, and then when somebody finishes a book, you can be like, to learn more about, the war of whatever and the world that it's in, come to my website. It's a great way to get readers back to your world to discover more books in your world. Does that make sense? So I try to start
Yeah,
keeping a central hub early
I
so
like
that you're
that.
pulling readers back. It's kind of like your well, like when we're writing a straight series, like if you're writing like, if Lee Child's writing a Reacher book, he's like, go check out the rest of these Reacher books. At the back of the book, he's like, click on this link to find the rest of the Reacher books. So you kind of need a like, hey, if you're gonna do this collage style storytelling where you're running in all of these different vehicles, you almost want like, hey, go back and look at the whole war so you can find other books in these parts
Yeah,
of the story. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah. But it'll give you that,
Yeah,
just talking about marketing, it'll give you that way to like tie everybody together
yeah,
and force readers to come back to what's happening. Yeah. Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, I like that. It gives me a lot to work with.
Yeah, and I think if I were trying to attack what you're trying to attack, I would probably do that first. I would build
Hmm.
that timeline. I'd build the now how it just out of curiosity, because part of what you're doing is talking about like the rise of technological advancement, like the industrial age, where all these cultures are connecting. Have you started building out how different are you going with the cultures? Are you like going big with the different?
Yeah, pretty giant because this world
Nice.
has huge physical differences. So like people have been isolated for, thousands and thousands of years. They have no knowledge of each other. There's,
Oh, I love it.
a few multiple races and yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's kind of there's a little bit of a Star Wars vibe to it in
Okay.
that there's, you've got to, except for it's all on one world. So,
Yeah, yeah.
there's giant desert, there's giant ice areas, giant swamps, it's Earth
Nice.
magnified.
Yeah, yeah. So they've got, but it's nice if they're all separated because they can look like
Yep.
very different creatures, which is very cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very different levels of technology. Some are very primitive, some are very advanced, some have different uh, social structures that are archaic, some are advanced but have archaic undertones. And,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
get to play with all that.
Do you have a system you're using for that yet? Have you like landed on any kind of system to help you design those?
So, mainly it's just me. I use Notion and it's just me gradually building out this giant world Bible,
Okay.
but I'm not using any like named system that I know of.
Okay. I keep
This is
thinking that,
my,
yeah. So I don't like this as a system for personality testing. People use it for personalities. I hate it for that. And I really don't like it as I really don't like it for personality. I'm just going to say that up front. And I don't like it. I've read books about how they use it in the State Department all the time. I don't like that either because it stratifies cultures, but spiral dynamics has interesting, if you're looking for inspiration, it has what I don't like about it is has stratified levels of cultural evolution, which I'm not a fan of like
okay.
stratifying things. But if you remove the stratification, it's got neat like different colors representing different types of cultures. It might help you
Hmm.
escalate. Again, I wouldn't do what Spiral Dynamics does with it. I just want to say again, in case anybody knows what Spiral Dynamics is, don't get mad at me. I don't like it for what they use it for. But because it's like, all right, a blue society, after they evolve so much, becomes a turquoise society. And if they evolve to this so much, they become like
Oh, right.
I'm not a fan of that, of the evolutionary, the way they use it, like evolutionary wise. But it's interesting in that it says like, this society, their main goal is just basic uh um sustaining of life, because their main
Right.
goal is basic sustaining of life. These are kind of the things that happen in that culture. This is how that culture operates. And then like, here's how that culture can be engaged with, and here's how engagement won't work with them. And so it gives you like a
Got it.
kind of system
Interesting.
for like, okay, here's a like culture that has had a religious phase, moved out of that religious phase, right? Engaging them religiously doesn't work because the culture's been beyond that religious phase, but engaging them intellectually tends to have a positive effect because they see themselves as beyond that. So it's an interest. It might be something that, I'd go look at it on Wikipedia, and you might get. I wouldn't go deeper than that. Just go read about it on Wikipedia. It might give you a little insight into like how you start to structure those cultures. Um,
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay.
what you
And that
what
was
you make of
Spiral.
spiral dynamics is what it's called.
Oh, no.
Again,
Oh,
not a proponent of spiral dynamics in the real world. As a tool for an author building a fantasy world, it might help you like think through some things. Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I have to keep saying not a proponent of real world use, but because it does stratify people groups, and I don't like that. But it's so but it is, I think it'll help you as you on a Tolkien type level of like how do these different societies work inside of each other? How do they differ culturally? Like how are the elves different than the dwarfs, than the orcs, than the hobbits? It's got some
Yeah.
good. I found it interesting when I was reading. I was like, man, if I was a fantasy writer or a D&D game master, I would probably use this more. Yeah,
That's funny. That yeah, I'm all about that because like love Lord of the Rings as much as any fantasy person out there. I've read the entire thing 14 or 15 times. Um, that being said, it is like this race has this culture.
yeah,
And if you're dwarves, for the most part, this is the culture you have. There's slight differences
yeah,
between the elves, but for the most part, it's one race equals one culture,
yeah,
except for the humans. So adding more dynamics to it, because I really wanted to have that level of scope, yet the realism of like I used to get depressed when I was a kid growing up. I would have moments where I'm writing and I get depressed because I'm like, I'm never going to live in this world. I'm still going to have to deal with streetlights and assholes and
yeah.
gangs and
Yeah. Where's my
I'd
hoverboard, man?
rather
Where's my flying car? Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So
Back to
so in
Future
any case,
promised me
I
that I would
wanted to
have a
be real
flying
enough.
car. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Whether it was a good idea or not, I
yeah,
wanted, damn it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this was
That's
really helpful.
oh good. Yeah, and again, I think my biggest I'm super excited to see where you go with it, man. My biggest caution for you though is don't get the world building is going to be super fun and engaging for you, but what's going to pull the reader in again is the Band of Brothers moment where he's at the tent with a peer and he pulls the guy out and he talks to him about leadership, right? Like it's those moments of like character growth and intimacy between characters that the reader's going to stick to. The world to
Yeah.
them is just kind of glue holding everything together and becomes fun. Like I didn't go look at a George R. R. Martin wiki until I was like 3/4 of the way through the first book. So I'm like, 100,000 words in before I give a crap to even go look at a map. But what got me to go
Yeah.
look at the map was like, man, I'm really fascinated in what Jon Snow is going through at the wall. I want to know about that more and like I want to know, I understand. I'm into Ned's son. I can't even remember his name because he dies so fast. Who's like bringing the army down. But
Yeah,
I'm
Rob.
Rob, yeah, but I'm into Rob because I like Rob and his mom's interactions, and I like Rob's interactions with like the people that he's around, and that's what makes me go look at the map. So like the map is going to be cool for you. The like, and by map I mean like the global systems. But what's going to be cool for the reader is living in those shoes. So like,
Yeah.
don't forget to like live in the scene. Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
love it. I love it.
yeah.
It feels a little less daunting.
Yeah, I'm glad, man, and I'm pumped for you. I think as you get that world built, I think you're going to get super excited about writing different characters and the different components. It's going to be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, let me hit stop on the recording, and we can chat a little bit more.